There was research from professors at Northwestern and Georgetown that found that companies that make political donations to the relevant politicians are 4 times more likely to get a subsidy, and those subsidies are about 2/3 bigger than companies that don't.
That's the voice of John Mozena. He's from the Center for Economic Accountability, and I thought today was a good day to release this conversation we recently had about incentives. And do incentives really work? Why today, though? Because the news is out that the Michigan Economic Development Corporation has approved $824 million in incentives for battery plants in Lake Orion and Lansing. What do these incentives do? Do they work? Some people say yes, and some people, like John, say no, and he lays out a compelling case. We also get into some very local things, talking about the city of Detroit and how they're structured and how they could be structured better for entrepreneurship. But first, thanks to our members on Patreon, patreon.com/dailydetroit, as well as our new option, Buy Me a Coffee. I've heard it from people. They want to be able to do a one-time thing. Buy 1, 2, or 3 coffees. Well, you can do that. buymeacoffee.com/dailydetroit to do that one-time thing. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back.
If people don't remember since the last time we talked, which was in the before time, 2019, why don't you set the table around what the Center for Economic Accountability does before we hop into all of this conversation?
Sure. We are a nonprofit. We're actually based here in suburban Detroit, but we work around the country, and we say that our mission is to advance economic opportunity across the country by bringing transparency, accountability, and market-based reforms to state and local economic development programs. And what that means is we look at the kinds of deals that here in Detroit, the highlight ones are the things like the subsidies and tax breaks that say, whether it's Dan Gilbert or Ford with the train station, or I guess Stellantis with the Mack Avenue plant, or any of the other entities that are getting sort of specific special breaks or benefits from government to, quote, create jobs. The idea that the public, the other taxpayers, are going to subsidize these companies, these projects, because of the argument that it's going to pay off in the end for everyone, for this one, developer or this one company to pay less in taxes or to get cash from the government.
This conversation is happening after a little bit of a Twitter chat where one of our listeners, I was having a conversation with a contributor, Eric Tritko, who, to be clear, he is not a lefty in any way, shape, or form, but we were talking about incentives and battery plants and all the things, and he kind of made the point, and we got into this discussion. In order to succeed, in order to even attract these companies, you have to play the incentive game, even if you don't like it. Here's the thing, John, like every single state, every single city is providing incentives in one way or another. The bottom line, though, is that, like, if you opt out, do you lose? So let's start there. If you opt out of this system, do you lose?
No, you don't. And that's the big thing, is that, it is a completely understandable view for people to have that, if we don't do this stuff, all the jobs are going to go someplace else. If we don't have these deals, there's going to be no more jobs, and we are going to fall down this economic rabbit hole. The problem is that that's simply not true. And there's a couple reasons why that's the argument that you, and this is a general, you have been hearing for decades and decades. And the biggest one and the easiest to explain it is that the people who are telling you that are the folks who benefit financially from these deals continuing to exist and grow. It is, the economic development agencies who, the people there are employed to run these deals. So they're going to tell you all about how wonderful they are. It's the companies that love free money, and it's the politicians who benefit politically from standing up there and taking credit for creating jobs. The reality is that virtually any researcher anywhere around the country, anywhere around the world, frankly, not even just around the U.S., anywhere around the political spectrum, this is an issue that just really doesn't break along red, blue, left, right lines. It's just straight facts. Just there's this massive, massive, massive research consensus that this stuff just doesn't work. You do not make a place more prosperous by taking money away from some group of taxpayers and giving it to like one or two or however many particular businesses. It's like saying that you're going to raise the water level in the Great Lakes by, filling up buckets in Lake Huron and going and dumping them in Lake Michigan. That's just not how this works. The actual research, the best research on this, actually comes from here in Michigan, the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research in Kalamazoo, which is an organization that most people haven't heard of, but is really deeply and widely respected around the world for their work in this space. Found that, it looked at all of the different research on this from all over the world and said, you know what, here's what everybody says. It's somewhere between, at best, maybe 1 out of every 4 times the subsidy actually changes what a company was going to do anyway. And at worst, it's like 1 in 20. And generally the reason for that is just that the subsidies aren't enough to change a business's decision. They might be a lot of money, but they're not enough to change a business's decision. So, for instance, I've been talking recently about, and this is a North Carolina thing, not a Detroit thing, but it's a good example. North Carolina announced a few months ago that they are going to give Apple Computer about $850 million to build a sort of East Coast campus in the Research Triangle there. That's a lot of money. And when you count in county stuff, it's going to be about $1 billion over the next 30 years. The problem is that, Apple this past year posted $1 billion a day in revenues. So while $1 billion might be a lot of money to the taxpayers of North Carolina, it's $1 billion worth of road repairs and sewers and all sorts of other public services that aren't going to get made. For a company like Apple that's getting $1 billion a day, it's not enough money to change the fundamental factors of where they're going to put a major thing. And so you see that over and over again, that when you actually start comparing the amount of money that's going out to like the actual pressures on the companies or the entities that are making these decisions, you understand why in the great scheme of things, it's just not enough money most of the time to change their plans for what they're going to do. I mean, companies make decisions like this for a whole host of business reasons. Where's the workforce? What's the regulatory environment? What's the broader tax rate? When, eventually sooner or later they're going to have to pay taxes. What's that going to look like? What's the infrastructure like? Where are your competitors? Where are your customers? Do you have access to things that you might need in terms of natural resources? Energy costs has popped up recently with the battery plants, all those sorts of things. Those are the factors that truly change business decisions. So we know that because that's what the site selection industry's own research says. Subsidies occasionally matter, but not often enough to justify the massive amounts of money we waste on them.
When you say that they don't attract business, they don't influence it that often, I can hear a few listeners right now saying, well, what about the film subsidies? We are not seeing many films made here in Michigan since that subsidy program ended. It's just not the same as it was. That's just clearly the truth. Was that a loser?
Oh, absolutely. Everybody agreed. That's why they got essentially why the legislature voted them away virtually unanimously. If I remember correctly, I might be getting this wrong, but what I remember seeing at the time was that even the state legislator whose wife ran the state film office voted to kill them, I think it was. Right now, Georgia is the leader in film subsidies. Oh, it's hey, wonderful. Oh, it's so great. Look at all the films that are getting made with Georgia there. Their state auditor has been screaming about how terrible these deals are. And it's currently at the size that every household in the state of Georgia is paying roughly $200 or so a year in film subsidies so that they can feel good about the fact that these films are created there. And the state auditor has been looking at that and saying, these jobs are BS. In fact, the film industry there, when they counted, quote, film industry jobs, the auditor went and found that the industry was literally claiming down to movie theater concession workers, the folks who make your popcorn at the local AMC or whatever, as, quote, film industry jobs for the purposes of making it look like those were a good idea for the state. Film subsidies are a great way of transferring money to wealthy people on the coast, and any subsidy that involves trusting Hollywood accountants to tell you the truth. I mean, these are the same people who say that Empire Strikes Back still hasn't made a profit.
All right, then what about something like brownfield development? So I'm intimately familiar with that because, Here in the city of Detroit, there are a lot of properties that, frankly, the numbers, and I've talked to a number of developers, if they don't get cleaned up before they work, the numbers just don't make any sense. This environmental remediation. What about something like that? A brownfield credit or something where the city goes in and cleans up land before it gets developed on?
Well, there's a couple different things happening there. The first is that the term brownfield gets abused. I mean, brownfield is a term that we sort of created to describe sort of building something where something else used to be, which human beings have been doing since we invented cities. So it's not a new issue. Most of the costs involved are the result of government regulation. You have to clean it up to comply with this government regulation, something along those lines. So that's a situation where, if it's something like, the Uniroyal plant or something like that, it is a cost that government has created through its regulatory structure. So you start saying like, okay, well, maybe I can start seeing why, if the government wants to do this, then it's worthwhile. That's a fuzzier thing. The problem is that in practice, this isn't just like, a Superfund program where it's the worst sites or something like that. Brownfield usually gets used for anything that's been declared blighted. A lot of games get played in the real world, and that's where a lot of political backscratching happens because, among other things, often what happens is that anything owned by a government is, the legal blight definition includes any property that is owned by the government. So what will happen is that a government will purchase the property, even if just for a sort of legal instant, so that it triggers the blight designation. So then therefore it can get the brownfield designation. So if you were actually going to limit brownfield to truly environmentally problematic parcels that are important from a development perspective, but need assistance just because it's not economically feasible to clean them up to like actually solve environmental problems, again, like a Uniroyal plant or something like that, that'd be a different discussion. But in the real world, that's not what happens with our brownfield things. Instead, what it actually becomes is basically another sort of under-the-table subsidy program for folks who are politically connected enough to get the government to make something blighted with its magic wand so that they get more free money than they would otherwise get.
So is this a sign that the underlying system is broken? Because I think about lots of developers tell me without subsidies, without some sort of thing, the development doesn't make money. Like straight up will not be profitable. They've shown me some sheets and some numbers and looking at it and going, well, this project doesn't even work unless we get some sort of subsidy. So is that a sign of underlying, like the tax rates are too high? Like in the city of Detroit, it's the second highest effective tax rate compared to New York City. Is that the case, or is it something else going on? Or is it a combination of A and B?
Some of it's just, frankly, just economics. It's the program, projects, quote, don't work because there's not enough demand among potential customers. Just, I look at the way that Detroit has changed over my lifetime. I'm 50 years old. Projects that never, ever would have made sense before, subsidies or not, now make sense because there's more demand for commercial, for residential in different parts of the city than would not have otherwise. And projects that would have made sense back in the day in the 50s or 60s would never make sense now because of changing population patterns and all those sorts of things. So a project not being viable without subsidies is not necessarily a sign of a failure, of a market failure or whatever. It's just a sign of the market. And maybe the project that this developer wants to do isn't going to make money because it's just not a good business idea. Maybe what they want to build there isn't what there's a market to build there. Maybe it will be someday. Maybe it would have been back in the past, but maybe just isn't now. That's the nature of the beast. If you want to put if you wanted to put a Myers out on 32 Mile Road or whatever now, there's probably going to be customers for it. Do that 20 years ago, it's going to be sitting in the middle of cornfields. Like, things change, and I don't want to get into a sort of sprawl discussion that's related, but not all this stuff. But there's a sort of, like I said, I spent time around commercial real estate and in this sort of stuff. Subsidies can make a good deal into a great deal, can make it into a deal that maybe developers feel like spending their time on and their money on, but they're rarely going to turn a bad deal into a good deal again, because, This is something that's going to be there for decades and decades and decades, if not centuries. And so, the idea that a short period tax break is going to turn it around versus, the fundamental marketplace is just what it's going to be. But I mean, you got into like tax rates. I mean, that to me is much more of the issue. When you look at Detroit, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and their nationwide review of sort of the biggest cities' tax rates point out that the last one they did before the pandemic, Detroit had the highest effective commercial and fourth highest industrial property tax rates in the country. And we all saw during the Great Recession the pain that the residential tax rates caused. More often than not, the cities that do the most in tax abatements and are spending the most money on subsidies are the ones that have the highest tax rates, because companies look at them and say, like, why would I build there? Your taxes are so high. What am I getting for those taxes? And the ROI for them of those taxes isn't high enough. And the city goes, like, okay, well, you don't have to pay those taxes. We'll just charge every other sucker those taxes. And that fundamentally is the problem, that somebody's paying those taxes, just not the politically connected, usually the big companies. And so, like, well, why not just lower them by the same amount for everyone rather than letting a, again, like a Stellantis or a Gilbert or a Ford or whoever it might be get away with not paying it while the other people who don't get those subsidies do.
Reading between the lines here, you're basically saying that this is being used as a political cudgel that allows politicians to extract things.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. And that's not just some like wild-eyed guy talking about this. I mean, that is the actual, like, there's actual like mainstream, serious, peer-reviewed research out there explaining this. There was research from professors at Northwestern and Georgetown that found that companies that make political donations to the relevant politicians are 4 times more likely to get a subsidy, and those subsidies are about 2/3 bigger than companies that don't. There's professors at Columbia and Princeton who went looking for why do states all of a sudden see these sudden like 20% or more spikes in their subsidy spending year over year. They're like, why all of a sudden does this jump all of a sudden? And they went looking at things like is it unemployment rate? Is it underlying economy? And they couldn't figure it out. And then finally they went and looked like, oh, it's that the governor's running for reelection, and twice as often to see a sudden big spike in subsidy spending when the governor's going into a reelection year.
It did not escape me that Governor Whitmer signed in those source subsidies for those battery plants and other things, $1 billion of subsidies, at the end of a legislation session right before an election year.
Yeah.
Like, that did not escape me. And I feel like that timing was obviously intentional.
You have, again, professors at Duke University and the University of Texas at Austin who went and actually quantified what kind of political advantage she might be able to see. And they found that a governor in a swing state who takes credit for, quote, winning, unquote, 1,000 manufacturing jobs through subsidies can see it doesn't really change partisans on either side, but it can change the voter intent of independent voters in the middle by roughly 9%. I mean, if you gain 9% among independents, that's going to win you a lot of elections. So, and again, those are just some examples off the top of my head. Over and over and over again, there's all sorts of evidence for the fact that subsidies are not economic tools, they're political tools. And that's, sort of going back to the original question of like, well, if we don't do this, then won't all the jobs go away? Well, no, because again, they're not actually really changing the economy. They're not changing the ways companies behave. What they're changing is your behavior. I say all the time, these deals don't exist to create jobs. They exist to make voters believe that politicians are responsible for creating jobs. And that's why sort of all 3 players in this, the ones that actually are sitting here talking to you about this, the MEDC and DGC and the like, the bureaucrats, and the politicians, and the companies are all part of that sort of whole machine. And so it's a huge problem. The best estimates, and they have to be estimates because this whole industry, all this everything is just deeply, deeply averse to transparency. I mean, that they're hostile to transparency. There's a reason that they actually made Michigan state legislators sign non-disclosure agreements so that the MEDC could tell them what kinds of companies they were negotiating with in advance of the pro forma one-day debate on the new subsidies. I mean, they actually made our legislators sign the NDA to get access to evidence that they would then use to inform their votes. That kind of hostility to transparency is so other. So we have to make this an estimate, but the best estimates are that there's about $95 billion worth of these deals across the country in any given year. That is, among other things, that is enough to fund the 11 smallest state budgets combined. Or for those who like think in terms of like, oh, like farm subsidies, it's 3 times as much as federal farm subsidies in terms of like corporate welfare programs out there. So it is a huge problem. It's real money, and it's a growing problem just because there's all these people who benefit from it and very few who benefit from fighting it.
One of the things that comes from doing almost 900 of these kinds of episodes and conversations is I get to put together some threads. So within the last few months, we had somebody on who talked about how Detroit's tax rates and high tax rates in general and the preferential system makes it very difficult for smaller Black developers. And if you look at the data, you see on the ground that Black home ownership is moving to the suburbs. Black people in general are not choosing the city of Detroit to live in. And there's data. No matter what the mayor says about the census number, the housing data from Bridge is very clear. And then you look at other developers who are doing more stuff, smaller developers doing more stuff in the city. And when I talk to folks, I hear it is so hard to do things. In fact, there is a restaurant that popped up and opened in Dearborn, and they said the reason why they did not choose the city was because of the red tape and the high costs. And that idea that if you are not privileged, you do not get the same deals. And I know that the administration and others like to kind of push past this. They don't like it when we talk about this. But I think fundamentally what happens is when you have a group that fundamentally does not have the same access to capital and you make the barriers higher, they're not going to stay there, right? And I think that's part of what you're seeing with this flight out of the city of money and dollars, the middle class of Detroit, the Black middle class leaving the city. They're just going where they can, frankly, prosper without having to deal with the government at every turn.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I get asked all the time, well, if we don't do subsidies, well, then what then should we do? And to quote Saul Alinsky like a good libertarian, one of his rules for radicals was that the price of a successful attack is a viable alternative. And so it's sort of like, okay, well, if we don't do this, then what do we do? And I come back and I talk to all sorts of folks around the country on this, and you hit the nail on the head, which is the idea that the places that are the most prosperous, the places that are prospering the most, have 2 things going for them. They have a workforce that companies want, and it's easy to do business there. And some of that is taxes, because taxes matter. And some of that is just regulatory environment. And, Detroit has really high taxes, and it has a slightly less horrific than it used to be, but still pretty horrific regulatory environment. And then it doesn't really have, in most cases, the workforce that companies are looking for. It has some, especially city of, but not many. There's not a gigantic cluster of high tech workers in the city of Detroit. Like I said, it might be in the suburbs, it might be in the region, but not in the city itself. Again, more than there used to be, but not as many as there were.
When I travel, and this is not just about the city, this is regionally, it strikes me just how much more commerce there is, how many opportunities there are for people that are doing different things. And it's a pace that I think we've kind of lost.
The single best sign, arguably, the single best sign of what a place's economy is going to look like in the future is small business formation rate in the present day. Mm-hmm. Are people starting small businesses? You don't grow by attracting big businesses. Big businesses are big because they've got most of their growth behind them. You grow, as Detroit did back in the day, by being a place where entrepreneurs can start and run and grow good businesses that create good jobs. Whether it's the Ford or any of those people, all the names we see around Detroit were the entrepreneurs who started a business and ran a business. An example I like to use that I think sort of should ring true to people is imagine Motown. You talked about Black entrepreneurs and the ability of Black people to create wealth and something meaningful in the city now in the current environment. Imagine Motown Records. Berry Gordy bought a duplex on West Grand Boulevard and installed his family, young growing family, upstairs and built a recording studio downstairs and in a large residential neighborhood. I think the home had like a photographer's studio or whatever in it beforehand. It wasn't the first time it had been used for commercial use, but it was sort of this mixed use thing that people like to do. And then as the company grew and was more successful, sort of like buying up homes around the neighborhood that you see when you go down there. Oh, okay, this is the performance studio. This is where like the bookkeeping and salespeople were. You could not do that in Detroit today. There is zero chance that in Detroit, in the modern environment on Berry Gordy Boulevard, that a young entrepreneur, young black man could sit there and get the planning and zoning permissions and the permits and everything necessary to like open up a recording studio in the middle of a residential community and then like flip things that had been zoned residential. And I mean, this is the same city that actually sued its own zoning board of appeals a couple of years ago for approving a zoning variance on a billboard on West Grand Boulevard. Like anybody who spent any time going to like Detroit Planning Commission or whatever meetings or the Council Planning and Economic Development Committee, it is just a torturous process, and they are so hostile to anything that doesn't fit their plan. And I think that if you can't do now what people did before to be successful in Detroit, isn't that a problem? Isn't that maybe where some of this came from? And why do we think that's necessary? It's not like Berry Gordy ruined West Grand Boulevard. They named the street after him. It must have been pretty cool. Why are we doing these things? What benefits are we gaining from all this stuff? And in an environment where people are trying to be creative in an environment where things have changed, where there's less density, where the prior environment is no longer, where things no longer look like what they used to in many parts of the city. Why are we trying to use the old plans, the old regulatory structures, letting the old concerns based in a different world run the way things are now? It just doesn't make any sense to me. And I think, frankly, one of the simplest things that the city could do in many ways is just get out of the way, whether it's in terms of how much money they're taking in terms of taxes, unless you're connected, or how many boxes you need to check, papers you need to file. I mean, it says something that one of the things that then FCA negotiated with the city when it was building the new Mack Avenue plant was a 24-hour turnaround time for city inspectors. Ask anybody else who's ever tried to build anything in the city if they got 24-hour turnaround time from city inspectors, because they're gonna have some stories for you.
It's something when we have progressive guests on here and they talk about that the tax rate's too darn high. And they actually say that lowering taxes in Detroit would be a progressive act. Like that is something, right? When you've got that kind of bipartisan agreement that it's broken.
Well, I was invited a couple, right before the pandemic. One of the last things I did before the pandemic was I got invited to a community group meeting up in Northwest Detroit, and I was invited by some representatives, among others, National Action Network, Riverdale Sharpton's group, and some other folks along those lines. And I was invited to go talk. It was a lot of people who were either had been at risk of foreclosure, had their foreclosed, or the people who were dealing with the impacts of the whole foreclosure crisis in their community. And they asked me to come and talk about sort of like while the residents of the city were having their homes taken from them by screwed up tax code, what was happening on the sort of corporate, industrial, whatever tax credit side. And I went up there and said, like, look, we probably disagree politically on that stuff. Like, here's some of the things that I work on. Here's some of the people that I'm sort of on my side. But it's like Frederick Douglass. I'll unite with anyone to do good and no one to do evil. What happened in those communities was evil. I was like, look, I'm this right-wing-ish, libertarian-ish guy, and I'm here telling you that this is like what happened in this community was wrong and bad and should not have happened. And it was a wonderful experience and a lot of interesting discussions that came out of it. I once, when I sort of started up the CEA, I was talking to a guy who'd been doing it for many years, Greg Leroy at Good Jobs First, a left-wing group that focuses on this stuff, does great work. And I said, okay, here's what we're doing. And he's like, welcome to the fight. We'll get the money back from the bastards. Then we'll fight about what to do with it. I mean, that's really what it is. I mean, you can hate and fear big business or you can hate and fear big government, but when the two of them get together, like it's the rest of us who get screwed. So it really isn't a partisan thing in any meaningful way. I enjoy working on stuff like this where I've got folks of good faith and of goodwill from all over the political spectrum. It really isn't a partisan thing, and it's a topic where I think in this hyper politicized, hyper partisan world we live in, it's a topic where we can really leave our partisan identities and our labels at the door and just be like, what makes sense? What works? What does the evidence show? And then where do we go from there?
So in that spirit of bipartisan cooperation, would you rather see an investment in quality of life over subsidies?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. Like quality of life is one of the, because that's good for business.
And what does that look like to you?
I mean, among other things, it means things like education and infrastructure and things like that. I mean, we have, I'm born and raised here, lived my whole life here. Like, I think we have a heck of a lot going for us in, southeastern Michigan, Metro Detroit, call it what you will. The problem is that, it's not for lack of, things to do or climate or anything like that. It's because of political dysfunction. And it's because of, frankly, in many cases, it's a function of having had this monoculture industry that ran things for so long for its own good. We had that single state recession, blessed be its memory, for so long, in part because that was a manufacturing recession. And so when we look at everything that we're doing to try to promote manufacturing, how about we take a step back and promote entrepreneurship? How about we promote small businesses? How about we try to make it easier to do things like run a home-based business? And so many people are really not going back to the office now. A lot of people dropped, they saw talk about how many people left the workforce. A lot of those folks are starting up small businesses. The new business formation rates spiked hard during COVID. Let's try to make it as easy as possible for folks to run a business out of their homes, because in many communities, regulatorily, it's very difficult to do that. And as somebody who's worked from home and who's been his own boss for times over the years, there's a lot that communities can do to try to make it easier to do that, or can make it harder to do that.
Before we get to our final question, if people are hearing you and they're intrigued by what you do, or they want to support what you're doing, or get active, what can they do?
Sure. The website is economicaccountability.org, or you can find us on Twitter at accountableecon, ECON. That's all the good names were taken by the time I got around to this. And we always appreciate support. We're a 501c3, and you can imagine we don't get a lot of corporate donations, so we're always looking for help. Or you can find me on Twitter personally at John Moz, JOHNMOZ, and you can sort of follow the links from there. Or, just come find me on the drums at a Detroit City FC match.
Which leads me to the final question by listener request, multiple listener request. We got to talk about DCFC for just a second. I know you're a huge fan. What are your thoughts about 2022 and the USL, and how excited are you about it?
I'm excited. It's one of those things where I hate the fact that this is what City had to do to keep growing. And not just, I guess disclosure, my family is, quote, owners of the team. My son, for those who've been around the club for a while, remember the little red kid running around in a red beret for so long, Captain Jack. That's my boy, who's now driving me to matches, thank goodness. I think it's one of those things where I think this was the next step in City's growth. I think they'd outgrown NISA clearly, just on the field, and as an organization, we were no longer at that level. And that I think it's a shame that in order to keep growing, that we had to buy into the sort of horrific American corporate soccer mess that is USL. Now, I also think that USL is less horrific American corporate soccer slightly than it used to be, because it's no longer just the sort of vermiform appendix of MLS. But I think that on the field, I think City will be competitive. Obviously, you're going to have to change the roster. I trust Trevor to do that correctly. I like having matches. I like having matches against teams that we can, drive and go visit. That's some of the stuff that I've loved over the years the most is going places for to support city in somebody else's stands. I wish American soccer were a different environment where we didn't have to do this and didn't have to sort of buy into that whole, like, here's a whole pile of money, now please let us play in your league model that we're the only country that's screwed up.
John Mozena, thank you so much for your time today. I know we went pretty much into the weeds today, but I think people will hopefully get something out of this conversation. If you've got thoughts, dailydetroit@gmail.com. And of course, check John's work out at economicaccountability.org. Thanks, sir.
Thanks, Jer.
And to those of you listening, thank you so much for tuning into your Daily Detroit. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and I'll see you around town. Talk next time.